Tasha was a kind-hearted young woman who worked as a waitress at a small, cozy cafe in the heart of the city. Every day, she served her customers with a warm smile and a cheerful attitude. Her regulars loved her because she always went the extra mile to make their experience special. But there was one customer in particular who held a special place in her heart: Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson was an elderly woman who had been coming to the cafe for years. She was in her late 70s and had a disability that made it difficult for her to move around. She used a walker to get around, but still managed to be independent in many ways. She always sat in the same corner of the cafe, near the window, where she could watch the world go by. Even though she struggled with her health, Mrs. Thompson was known for her positive attitude and infectious laugh. Her presence was always a bright spot in the cafe, and Tasha looked forward to serving her every week. Their first meeting was simple but unforgettable. It was a busy day at the cafe, and Tasha was rushing around to take orders and serve food. When Tasha noticed Mrs. Thompson sitting at her usual table, she quickly walked over to greet her. Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly and introduced herself, mentioning she had been coming to the cafe for years. She was a bit frail and needed help with her walker, so Tasha gently assisted her as she settled into her chair. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Thompson said with a soft voice. "I always appreciate your kindness." Tasha was taken aback by how kind and gracious the elderly woman was. She quickly got into a conversation with Mrs. Thompson as she took her order. Over time, they began to talk more and more about their lives. Tasha learned that Mrs. Thompson had been married for over 50 years before her husband passed away. She had children who lived far away, but they visited her whenever they could. She told Tasha about the challenges of living with a disability, how sometimes it felt like her world had gotten smaller, but how she refused to let that stop her from enjoying life. Tasha admired Mrs. Thompson's strength and resilience. She often found herself looking forward to her conversations with the elderly woman. She would visit Mrs. Thompson's table whenever she had a moment, just to chat and make sure she had everything she needed. Mrs. Thompson had become more than just a customer to her. She had become a friend. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. Tasha noticed that Mrs. Thompson had a way of making everyone around her feel better, no matter how hard their day had been. Her optimism was contagious. Despite her challenges, Mrs. Thompson never seemed to lose her spirit. The cafe became a little brighter every time Mrs. Thompson walked in, and Tasha made sure to always greet her with a smile, knowing that it would make the elderly woman's day. It wasn't just about the food or the service. It was about the friendship they had formed over time. But neither of them knew that their story was about to take a surprising turn. This was just the beginning of a beautiful and unexpected journey that would change both of their lives forever. As the months went by, Tasha and Mrs. Thompson's bond continued to grow. Tasha made it a point to visit her table during every shift, even if it was just to check in for a quick chat. Mrs. Thompson had a way of making Tasha feel like she was the most important person in the room, even though she was just one of many customers in the cafe. She always listened to Tasha's stories about her life, offering wisdom and kindness in return. One afternoon, when Tasha brought Mrs. Thompson her usual coffee and pastry, the elderly woman noticed that Tasha seemed a little more tired than usual. "You look a little worn out today, dear," Mrs. Thompson said gently, giving her a concerned look. Tasha smiled, trying to hide the exhaustion. "I guess the cafe's been a little busier than usual, but I'm all right. Just been working a lot of hours lately." Mrs. Thompson studied her for a moment, then reached into her purse. "You know, sometimes when life gets busy, it helps to take a moment for yourself," she said, pulling out a small, carefully folded envelope. "Here's something for you. I don't have much, but it's a little gift." Tasha was surprised. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson, you really don't have to do that," she said, feeling a little uncomfortable receiving anything. "I know I don't have much, but it's from the heart," Mrs. Thompson insisted, pushing the envelope gently into Tasha's hand. With a smile, Tasha accepted the gift and promised to open it later. She didn't want to make Mrs. Thompson feel like her gift wasn't appreciated. After all, it wasn't the gift that mattered, it was the thought behind it. The rest of the day went on as usual, but Tasha couldn't help but wonder what could be inside the envelope. She was curious but waited until her shift ended to take a look. Once she was at home, she carefully opened the envelope. Inside, she found a handwritten note and a key. The note read, "Dear Tasha, you've been such a light in my life, and I want you to know how much I appreciate your kindness. This key is for the little cottage I own down by the lake. I'm not able to go there anymore, but I'd like you to have it. It's a peaceful place where you can rest and find some time for yourself. You deserve it." Tasha was stunned. She didn't know what to say. Mrs. Thompson, a woman she had only known for a few months, was offering her a place to rest, a place to escape the business of her life. It was such a kind and unexpected gesture, and Tasha was overwhelmed with gratitude. The key in her hand felt heavy with the meaning of what it represented. It wasn't just a gift of a peaceful place. It was a symbol of the deep trust and connection that had developed between them. Tasha hadn't expected such an offer, and she wasn't sure if she should accept it. But the thought of taking a break in such a peaceful place, away from the hustle of everyday life, was incredibly tempting. The next day, when Tasha saw Mrs. Thompson again, she couldn't hide the gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I don't know what to say. This is such a generous gift. I don't deserve it." Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly. "You deserve all the rest and peace you can get, dear. I see how hard you work, and I want to give you a little something back. Don't worry about deserving it. Just enjoy it." Tasha felt a wave of appreciation and love for the woman sitting before her. She had truly made a difference in her life, and Tasha knew that she would forever be grateful for this unexpected kindness. Little did Tasha know that this simple act of generosity would soon lead to a much bigger surprise, one that would change her life in ways she could never have imagined. After receiving Mrs. Thompson's unexpected gift, Tasha couldn't stop thinking about the little cottage by the lake. For days, she felt a sense of calm just imagining the peaceful surroundings. It was a place far from the noise of the city, far from the pressures of everyday life. She had always dreamed of taking a break, but it had never seemed possible. Now, thanks to Mrs. Thompson, the opportunity was right in front of her. One weekend, after a particularly stressful week at the cafe, Tasha decided it was time to take Mrs. Thompson up on her offer. She packed a small bag with clothes, toiletries, and her favorite book. She felt a little nervous at first, but the thought of spending a weekend in a quiet, peaceful place gave her the reassurance she needed. It was time to recharge. When she arrived at the cottage, Tasha was amazed by how serene it was. The little house was nestled on the edge of a beautiful lake, surrounded by tall trees and gentle hills. The air was fresh, and the only sounds she could hear were the rustling of leaves and the soft ripples of water. It felt like stepping into another world, one far away from the stress of daily life. The cottage itself was simple but charming. It had cozy wooden floors, a fireplace, and a large window that looked out over the lake. Tasha instantly felt at home. She put down her bag, made herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window, gazing out at the water. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe deeply and relax without any worries. As the day turned into evening, Tasha took a walk around the lake. She marveled at the beauty of the surroundings. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting a golden glow on the water. She had never experienced such tranquility before. It was like the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders, and she could finally just be present in the moment. That evening, Tasha made a simple dinner in the cottage's small kitchen. She spent hours eating, reading, and enjoying the quiet. There were no phone calls, no distractions, no rush. She could feel the tension in her body melting away. She even felt more energized than she had in months. As Tasha sat by the fire later that night, she reflected on how much Mrs. Thompson's kindness had meant to her. The elderly woman had been a source of inspiration for Tasha, showing her that it was possible to make a real difference in someone's life with even the smallest gesture. Mrs. Thompson hadn't just given Tasha a place to relax. She had given her the chance to reconnect with herself and remember what it felt like to slow down and appreciate the little things. Tasha knew that she would always be grateful for this moment, for the chance to escape from the pressures of life and find peace. And as the days passed, she realized something even more important. The kindness she had received was not just about the cottage or the gift. It was about the relationship that had blossomed between her and Mrs. Thompson. It was a bond built on trust, understanding, and love. And as Tasha walked through the quiet streets of the little town, she couldn't help but think about how much more she could give to others, just like Mrs. Thompson had given so much to her. The weekend at the cottage had left Tasha feeling refreshed, but as she returned to the cafe, she noticed something within herself had shifted. The peacefulness she had found in the small lakeside home stayed with her, and she started to see the world in a new light. Tasha no longer felt overwhelmed by her responsibilities. She felt empowered and hopeful. Back at the cafe, Mrs. Thompson continued to come in every Wednesday for her usual cup of coffee. But this time, Tasha looked forward to their chats more than ever. There was something comforting about the older woman's company. Her wisdom, her calm nature, and her gentle sense of humor made every conversation feel special. One Wednesday, as Mrs. Thompson sat down at her usual spot by the window, Tasha walked over with her coffee and a smile. She had something important to share. "Mrs. Thompson," Tasha began, "I just wanted to thank you again for the time I spent at the cottage. It was exactly what I needed. I feel more at peace now, and I've started thinking about things differently." Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly. "I'm so glad to hear that, dear. You deserve it. Sometimes life gets so busy that we forget to take care of ourselves. But it's never too late to slow down." Tasha nodded in agreement. She had learned that lesson over the weekend. After years of rushing through life, she realized that it was okay to pause and focus on what truly mattered: her well-being, her happiness, and her relationships. For the first time in a long while, Tasha felt like she was taking control of her life. She had learned to appreciate the little things, a moment of stillness, the beauty of nature, and the simple joy of a quiet day. As the weeks passed, Tasha continued to spend time with Mrs. Thompson. Their bond grew stronger with each conversation. Tasha started to look forward to their weekly meetings, finding comfort in the shared moments and stories. The older woman had become not only a mentor, but also a dear friend. Tasha also began to take small steps to improve other areas of her life. Inspired by the peace she had found at the cottage, she decided to start volunteering at a local shelter on her days off. She felt that it was important to give back, just as Mrs. Thompson had given so much to her. One day, after a particularly fulfilling volunteer shift, Tasha met a woman named Carla. Carla was a mother of two who had recently moved to the area and was struggling to make ends meet. Tasha instantly connected with her, feeling a deep sense of empathy for her situation. After speaking with Carla for a while, Tasha invited her to meet Mrs. Thompson the following week. "I think you two will really get along," Tasha said. "You both have a lot of wisdom and warmth to share." When the day came, Tasha introduced Carla to Mrs. Thompson, and the two instantly hit it off. Their conversation was filled with laughter and genuine connection, and Tasha felt a sense of pride in bringing two wonderful women together. It was another reminder of the power of kindness and the unexpected ways that connections could form. As Tasha continued to share moments like these, she realized how much she had grown. Her life was filled with people who cared about her, and she had a renewed sense of purpose. The journey she had taken, from the hustle and bustle of her everyday routine to the quiet peace of the cottage and the connection she had forged, had shown her that there was always room for growth and new beginnings, and that the greatest gifts were the relationships we built along the way. Weeks passed, and Tasha's life seemed to take a new shape. Her perspective had shifted, and she felt more grounded than she had in a long time. She was starting to realize that there was more to life than just work and obligations. Slowly, she was learning to appreciate the present, focusing on the moments that mattered most and the people who made a difference in her life. One morning, while working her usual shift at the cafe, Tasha noticed something different. Mrs. Thompson had arrived earlier than usual and was sitting quietly by the window. There was a hint of sadness in her expression, something Tasha had never seen before. As she walked over to greet her, she immediately noticed that Mrs. Thompson's hands were shaking slightly. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Tasha said, trying to sound as cheerful as possible. "How are you today?" Mrs. Thompson looked up, her face softening into a tired smile. "Oh, Tasha, dear, I've been thinking about something important," she said, her voice steady, but filled with a trace of concern. Tasha paused, sensing that something was weighing on her friend's mind. She sat down beside Mrs. Thompson, offering a quiet space for her to speak. "What's on your mind?" Tasha asked gently. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, as if gathering her thoughts, before finally speaking. "Well, my daughter, Margaret, is going through a rough time. She's been struggling with her health, and I can see how much it's affecting her. I wish there was more I could do, but sometimes I feel like I'm just not enough." Tasha's heart sank as she listened. She could feel the love and worry in Mrs. Thompson's words. It was clear that her friend was deeply concerned for her daughter, but also feeling a sense of helplessness. Without thinking, Tasha placed her hand gently on Mrs. Thompson's. "You've already done so much for Margaret. Just being there for her is more than enough. You don't have to fix everything. Sometimes, just offering love and support is the most important thing." Tasha's words seemed to soothe Mrs. Thompson, and she gave a small nod. "You're right, Tasha. I just wish there was more I could do. I want to take away her pain, but I know that's not possible." Tasha smiled softly, offering her friend a reassuring look. It's not always about taking away someone's pain. Sometimes it's about being present, showing up, and helping them through it, even if you can't fix everything. As Mrs. Thompson sat quietly, her eyes filling with tears, Tasha felt a deep sense of empathy. She had been there before, feeling helpless in the face of someone else's suffering. But she also knew that the act of listening, offering comfort, and simply being there for someone was a powerful gift. After a few moments of silence, Mrs. Thompson spoke again, her voice steadier. "Thank you, Tasha. I needed to hear that. You've always known just what to say." Tasha smiled, feeling grateful for the opportunity to support her friend. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew that sometimes just showing up and offering a listening ear was enough. Over the next few weeks, Tasha continued to spend time with Mrs. Thompson, offering her support as she navigated her daughter's challenges. Tasha also took it upon herself to check in on Margaret, offering to help with errands or just chat when she needed someone to talk to. Tasha's kindness had a ripple effect, not just on Mrs. Thompson, but on everyone around her. Her life had become filled with moments of connection, and she began to realize that the most meaningful relationships were those built on compassion, understanding, and support. As Tasha continued to build new connections and strengthen old ones, she found herself more connected to her community than ever before. The love she had been giving out was returning to her in ways she hadn't expected. And in that, she found peace, knowing that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or planned. They were the quiet moments of connection and the strength of the people around her. One afternoon, Tasha received a call from Mrs. Thompson, her voice urgent but calm. "Tasha, could you come over? It's Margaret. She's in the hospital, and I don't know what to do." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. Margaret, Mrs. Thompson's daughter, had been dealing with ongoing health issues, but Tasha never imagined it would lead to this. Without hesitation, she grabbed her jacket and rushed to the hospital. When Tasha arrived, Mrs. Thompson was pacing outside the emergency room, her face pale and full of worry. Tasha quickly went to her side, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm here, Mrs. Thompson," Tasha said softly, trying to offer some reassurance. "How is she?" Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. "They're running tests, but she's been feeling worse lately. I just don't know what to do anymore." Tasha looked into her eyes, and saw the familiar worry that had always been there. This wasn't just about Margaret's health. It was about the fear of not being able to help, the helplessness that comes with watching a loved one suffer. "Let's wait together," Tasha said, trying to sound hopeful. "You don't have to go through this alone." The two of them sat in the hospital waiting area, the silence between them thick with worry. Tasha didn't know exactly what to say, but she knew that just being there with Mrs. Thompson meant something. Sometimes words weren't necessary. Simply showing up and offering support was the most powerful thing a person could do. After what felt like hours, the doctor came out with news. He smiled gently as he approached Mrs. Thompson. "Mrs. Thompson, Margaret is stable now. We found a treatment that should help her. It's going to be a long road, but she'll be okay." Tasha breathed a sigh of relief, and Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." The doctor smiled and patted her arm. "Don't thank me yet. She's strong. It's just going to take some time." With the weight lifted from her shoulders, Mrs. Thompson turned to Tasha, who had stayed by her side the entire time. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Tasha. You've been a true friend to me, and I'm so grateful." Tasha smiled and shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just happy I could be here for you." The relief that Mrs. Thompson felt was shared by Tasha, but she knew this wasn't the end of the road. Margaret's recovery would be slow, and there would be more struggles ahead. But Tasha understood now more than ever that the most important thing was being present, offering support, and showing up when it counted. As the days passed, Tasha continued to visit Margaret and Mrs. Thompson. She helped with small things, like bringing meals or running errands, but she knew that what mattered most was her presence. Each visit, whether it was filled with laughter or silence, meant the world to Mrs. Thompson, and Tasha could see how much it helped her friend cope. One day, as Tasha sat with Mrs. Thompson in the hospital room, Margaret smiled weakly and held out her hand. "Thank you, Tasha," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you either. You've been there for my mom, and that means the world to me." Tasha squeezed her hand gently, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. In that moment, she realized that these connections, these bonds of love and friendship, were the true gifts in life. The small moments of kindness, the quiet acts of support, were what made life meaningful. And she was proud to be part of something so important. As the days grew brighter, Tasha knew that Margaret's recovery would take time, but she also knew that she would continue to be there for Mrs. Thompson and her family. They had become more than just acquaintances. They had become family, and Tasha would be there for them through every step of the journey ahead. Several months passed, and Margaret's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. The doctors were optimistic, but it was clear that the road ahead was still long. During this time, Tasha remained by Mrs. Thompson's side, offering her support in every way she could, whether it was helping with groceries or simply sitting and talking. Tasha knew that these small actions were more meaningful than anything else. Margaret's health had improved, and she was beginning to regain some strength. There were still days when the pain was too much, but she was learning how to manage it, and she no longer felt completely helpless. The once heavy air of uncertainty had lifted, and now there was hope. One day, as Tasha sat in the living room with Mrs. Thompson, sipping tea and chatting, Margaret walked into the room with a big smile on her face. She looked stronger than she had in weeks, and her energy was returning. "Hey, Tasha," Margaret said, her voice warm and filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for everything you've done for me and my mom. I can't express how much it means to us." Tasha smiled back, her heart swelling with pride. "You don't have to thank me, Margaret. I'm just glad to see you getting better." Margaret shook her head. "No, seriously. You've been a constant support, and I don't know how I would have made it through without you. It's not just the big things, but the little things, like how you showed up every time I needed you." Tasha could feel the emotion in Margaret's words, and she could see the strength returning in her friend's eyes. "I'm just glad I could be there for you, Margaret," Tasha replied softly. "That's what friends do." Mrs. Thompson, who had been quietly listening in the background, looked at Tasha with a mixture of pride and love. "You're not just a friend to us, Tasha. You're family. You've been there for us through everything, and we are so grateful to have you in our lives." Tasha felt a rush of warmth flood her chest. She had never expected to form such a strong bond with this family. But in that moment, she understood that what they shared was more than friendship. It was a bond built on trust, love, and understanding. As the days passed, Tasha continued to visit Margaret and Mrs. Thompson, helping in any way she could. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but she felt confident that they would face them together. The journey to recovery was far from over, but Margaret was no longer alone. One afternoon, as the three of them sat together in the garden, Margaret looked at Tasha with a mischievous glint in her eye. "You know, I think it's time we start planning a celebration. I'm almost back to full strength, and we have so much to be grateful for." Tasha laughed. "A celebration sounds like a great idea, but what should we celebrate?" "Life," Margaret replied simply. "We've been through a lot, but we've made it, and now we can move forward with hope and strength." Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly, her eyes filled with emotion. "I couldn't agree more. It's time to look ahead, not behind." And so they began planning the celebration, a small gathering of family and friends to mark the milestone of Margaret's recovery. As they laughed and made plans, Tasha realized that it wasn't just about the big events or grand gestures. It was the small moments, the quiet support, and the love they shared that truly mattered. The journey was far from over, but with each passing day, Tasha felt that she had made a difference in someone's life. And in return, she had gained a family who would always be there for her. Together, they had faced the hardest days, and together, they would face whatever came next. Through all the challenges and struggles, they had found hope, and most importantly, each other. Tasha knew, deep in her heart, that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, and she was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had the love and support of her chosen family to carry her through.